He thought the royal guard wouldn't move. He was wrong. In 1 second, the protester attacked. 3 seconds later, he was flat on his back. Here's how it all unfolded. But before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel because tomorrow at the same time, we'll bring you another story of courage and discipline from the royal guards that you won't want to miss. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered for photos with the iconic royal guards. The air should have been filled with excited chatter and camera clicks, but today a different energy crackled through the crowd, tense, uncertain, with an undercurrent of something volatile. Malcolm Reed pushed his way through the throng of visitors, his weather-beaten face set in rigid lines of determination. At 42, his once idealistic features had hardened into something more severe. Deep creases framing his mouth, eyes narrowed with perpetual suspicion. The flagpole he carried was technically permitted for demonstrations at designated areas near government buildings, but the way his knuckles whitened around it suggested a purpose beyond simply displaying the protest banner that hung limply in the still air. "They stand there like nothing's wrong," he muttered loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "guarding the very institutions that keep us all in chains." His London accent carried traces of formal education beneath its deliberately roughened edges. 20 feet away, guard Thomas Fletcher maintained his position with perfect military precision. 2 tours in Afghanistan had taught him to recognize threats without betraying awareness. A skill now serving him well as he catalogued Malcolm's aggressive stance, the flagpole's weight and length, the man's increasingly agitated movements. Yet Fletcher's expression revealed nothing, his eyes fixed forward in the timeless stance of the Queen's Guard. "Look at him," Malcolm's voice rose, deliberately provocative, "standing there like a statue while they cut our benefits, raise our rents, pollute our air." He gestured with the flagpole toward the guard, coming just shy of the invisible boundary that separated acceptable protest from interference with duty. "Do you even think for yourself, mate? Or do they program that out of you when they put on that ridiculous hat?" A middle-aged woman pulled her children closer, their excitement at seeing the famous guards now tempered with uncertainty. An elderly man with a veteran's pin on his lapel watched Malcolm with narrowed eyes, his hand unconsciously straightening his posture in solidarity with the guard under verbal attack. "You know why they don't respond, don't you?" Malcolm turned to address the crowd directly now, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone who'd given this speech before. "It's because they can't defend what they're guarding, can't justify standing watch over a system that's rigged for the powerful." Guard Fletcher's training ran deeper than merely standing motionless. Each insult was noted, each movement tracked, but none penetrated the armour of his discipline. Behind the ceremonial uniform beat the heart of a combat veteran who had faced genuine threats far deadlier than angry words. His bearing remained perfect, shoulders squared, chin level, rifle positioned exactly according to regulations. Only the smallest tightening around his eyes betrayed his heightened awareness. "I pay your salary." Malcolm stepped closer, emboldened by the guard's silence. "My taxes buy that fancy uniform, that rifle you're holding. Doesn't that make me your boss?" He was close enough now that Fletcher could smell coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "What would happen if I just—" Malcolm reached out as if to touch the guard's uniform, stopping just short of contact, testing boundaries. A quiet murmur ran through the crowd, phones lowered as discomfort replaced the desire to document. This wasn't the light-hearted tourist experience they'd come for. This was something darker, something building toward a confrontation that no one wanted to witness, yet no one seemed able to prevent. "Sir," a voice cut through the tension. A palace security officer approaching with measured steps. "I'll need to ask you to step back and lower your voice." Malcolm turned, his expression lighting with a new target for his anger. "Public space, mate. I know my rights. I'm not breaking any laws." "Not yet," the officer replied evenly. "But you're approaching that line." For a moment, Malcolm seemed to consider this, the flagpole dipping slightly in his grip. Then his jaw set again, harder than before. "Tell your toy soldier here that people are suffering while he plays dress-up. Tell him the kingdom he's guarding is falling apart for regular folks like me." The security officer's radio crackled with a status check. As he turned slightly to respond, Malcolm's attention swung back to Guard Fletcher, whose impassive face seemed to further fuel the protesters' anger, as if that very discipline were a personal affront, a challenge that demanded to be broken. "I wonder," Malcolm said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet, "what it would take to get a reaction from you, to make you remember you're a person, not just a symbol of a corrupt system." The flagpole rose slightly in his grip, the movement casual, yet somehow threatening. The security officer ended his radio call, turning back with a new alertness in his posture. Something had shifted in the atmosphere, something recognizable to anyone trained to sense when words were about to become actions. Guard Fletcher felt it too, though nothing in his perfect stance betrayed that awareness. Malcolm took another step forward, crossing an invisible line from protest into provocation. Malcolm's journey to this moment hadn't been a straight line from peaceful citizen to aggressive protester. 3 years ago, he'd been a respected community organizer, arranging orderly demonstrations against housing policies that had forced his elderly parents from their lifelong home. His methods then had been reasoned arguments and proper channels, petition drives, council meetings, organised marches with proper permits. "You think I want to be here?" Malcolm addressed a young couple who had stepped away from the growing confrontation. "I used to believe in working within the system." The bitterness in his voice carried the weight of repeated disappointments. Wrote letters, attended hearings, followed every rule they set. And what changed? Nothing. Guard Fletcher remained motionless, but his military-trained senses were cataloguing every detail. The way Malcolm's weight shifted forward when his voice rose, how the flagpole moved from a vertical position to a more diagonal angle with each gesture. The security officer's hand hovering near his radio, ready to call for backup. All this Fletcher processed while maintaining the perfect stillness his position demanded. "They don't listen until you make them uncomfortable," Malcolm continued, projecting his voice to the crowd rather than the guard now. "Until you disrupt their pretty ceremonies and tourist attractions." He gestured toward Buckingham Palace with contempt. "Millions for royal upkeep, while people sleep in doorways 3 streets over." Among the onlookers, a silver-haired man in a tweed jacket watched with growing concern. Colonel James Harrison, retired, recognised the escalating signs of a situation about to boil over. 30 years in the Royal Marines had taught him to read the pre-violence indicators that civilians often missed. "He's looking for a reaction," Colonel Harrison murmured to his wife, "and he's not going to stop until he gets one." Malcolm had begun pacing now, 5 steps left, 5 steps right, creating a moving barrier between tourists and the guard. With each pass, he came slightly closer to Fletcher, the flagpole occasionally entering the guard's personal space, though never quite making contact. "Do you know what it's like to choose between heating and eating?" Malcolm's voice had taken on a performative quality, asking questions that demanded no answers. "While they sit in gilded rooms, deciding which palace to visit this weekend." His eyes searched Fletcher's impassive face for any flicker of response, frustration growing when he found none. The security officer had been joined by a colleague, both maintaining a watchful distance while speaking quietly into their radios. Their presence seemed to further agitate Malcolm rather than deter him. "See how they protect their symbols?" He jabbed the flagpole in their direction. "Quick enough to defend a man in a costume, aren't they? Where's this response when working people need protection?" Colonel Harrison edged closer, positioning himself where he could intervene if necessary. He'd seen this pattern before. The escalating rhetoric, the increasing physical movements, the seeking of audience validation. The colonial's trained eye noted how Malcolm's gestures with the flagpole were becoming less theatrical and more targeted. "Young man," Fletcher heard the colonel's measured voice addressing Malcolm, "there are better venues for your concerns than harassing a guard who's performing his duty." Malcolm turned, finding a new focus for his anger. His duty? Standing perfectly still while representing a system that's crushing people? That's not duty. That's complicity. "That guard likely served in combat before taking this post," the colonel continued calmly. "Many of these men have risked their lives in actual service." "Then he should know better than to prop up this facade," Malcolm's voice rose sharply. The flagpole now pointed directly at Fletcher's chest, trembling slightly with its owner's increasing agitation. "Anyone who's seen real suffering should refuse to be part of this pageantry while people suffer." Fletcher's military training had included extensive sections on threat assessment. Malcolm now displayed 7 of the 9 pre-attack indicators: elevated voice, invasive positioning, targeted gesturing, rapid breathing, flushed face, repetitive movement patterns, and fixation on perceived adversary. Only physical posturing and verbal ultimatums remained before action typically followed. "Sir, this is your final warning," the security officer called. "Back away from the guard immediately." Malcolm laughed, a harsh sound without humour. "Or what? You'll arrest me for talking, for pointing out what everyone should be able to see?" He turned back to Fletcher, eyes narrowed with challenge. "What about you, soldier? Got anything to say for yourself? Or are you just going to keep pretending you're not even human?" The crowd had grown larger but quieter, the uncomfortable silence of witnesses who sense approaching conflict but remain unsure how to prevent it. Parents guided children away, but many adults stayed, caught between concern and morbid curiosity. "That uniform doesn't make you better than us," Malcolm continued, his words coming faster now. "Doesn't put you above questioning, doesn't make what you're defending right." The colonel moved closer, recognizing the final warning signs of imminent action. Malcolm's knuckles had gone white around the flagpole, his weight shifting subtly to his back foot, the unconscious preparation to generate force. "I bet you've never missed a meal in that fancy uniform, have you?" Malcolm's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. "Never had to choose which bill to pay this month? Never been told there's no housing available while foreign investors buy up empty apartments?" 2 police officers had joined the security personnel at the perimeter of the scene, their presence deliberately non-confrontational but watchful. They exchanged glances with Colonel Harrison, who gave an almost imperceptible nod, acknowledgement passing between professionals who recognized a situation balancing on a knife's edge. "Sir," one officer called, "we respect your right to express your views, but you need to step back from the guard and lower that flagpole." Malcolm barely spared them a glance. Always protecting property and symbols, never people. His attention remained fixed on Fletcher, whose discipline hadn't wavered despite 20 minutes of escalating provocations. "What do they tell you about us, soldier? That we're just troublemakers? That we don't understand how the world works?" Fletcher's eyes remained forward, his breathing controlled and even. In Afghanistan, he'd maintained position under far more dire circumstances, including a 6-hour firefight where blinking at the wrong moment could have meant death. This verbal assault, while unpleasant, barely registered against that scale of pressure. "Look at him." Malcolm turned to the crowd again, seeking allies. "They've trained him well, haven't they? Stripped away everything human." The flagpole cut through the air as he gestured. "This is what they want from all of us. Obedience, silence, blind respect for authority." Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his military bearing evident despite his civilian clothes. "Young man, there's a difference between protest and harassment. You crossed that line several minutes ago." "And who are you to decide where that line is?" Malcolm challenged, the flagpole now pointing directly at the colonel. "Another one who served the Empire, who helped them take what wasn't theirs." "I served alongside men like him," Harrison replied evenly, nodding toward Fletcher. Men who believe in protecting people's rights, including your right to speak freely. But that freedom doesn't extend to threatening behavior. Malcolm's laugh was bitter. Threatening? I'm one man with a flag. He's the one with a rifle. A ceremonial weapon, Harrison corrected, which he's handling with perfect discipline despite your provocations. That discipline isn't weakness, son. It's strength few civilians understand. Something in the colonel's calm assessment seemed to further inflame Malcolm's anger. His movements became more erratic, the flagpole now slicing through the air with each emphatic point. Don't you dare lecture me about strength, Malcolm's voice rose sharply. I've fought my battles without weapons, without uniforms, without the protection of the state behind me. Fletcher noted the increasing proximity of the flagpole to his position with each swing. His peripheral vision caught the subtle hand signals from the police officers as they prepared to intervene. Military training had him calculating distances, angles, and response options, while his exterior remained perfectly composed. This guard, this soldier you're defending, Malcolm continued, the flagpole now passing within inches of Fletcher's face, stands here representing everything that's keeping people down. The monarchy, the class system, the military-industrial complex that profits from suffering. Step back, sir. The police officer's tone had shifted from request to command. Final warning. Malcolm spun toward the officer, his movements becoming increasingly unpredictable. Or what? You'll arrest me for speaking truth to power, for daring to question your precious symbols, for threatening behavior with a potential weapon, the officer clarified, taking a measured step forward. Weapon? Malcolm's voice rose with indignation, the flagpole raised higher in his grip. This is a symbol of protest, of resistance. If you're threatened by a flag, what does that say about what you're defending? The crowd had begun to disperse at the officer's quiet urging, creating more space around the confrontation. Those who remained watched with the tense anticipation of witnesses to an approaching storm. He won't even look at me. Malcolm's focus snapped back to Fletcher, stepping closer until only inches separated them. Too afraid to face what he's really guarding, too cowardly to acknowledge what he represents. Fletcher remained motionless, but his combat-trained senses registered every shift in Malcolm's stance, every tightening muscle, every indicator of imminent action. 8 years of military service had taught him to recognize the moment when words became merely the prelude to physical threat. And that moment had arrived. It happened in an instant. The line between heated protest and physical assault crossed in one fluid, irreversible motion. "Look at me when I'm talking to you!" Malcolm shouted, his patience finally shattering. The flagpole, no longer a symbolic object but now a weapon, arced through the air with deliberate force aimed directly at Guard Fletcher's head. Time seemed to compress for Fletcher. Combat training, activated responses, honed through thousands of hours of drills and real-world experience. His mind registered the attack trajectory, calculated response options, and implemented a defense, all within the fraction of a second between Malcolm's decision to strike and the flagpole's arrival. Fletcher's movement, when it came, was so precise and economical that many onlookers would later disagree about what they'd actually witnessed. One fluid motion brought his ceremonial rifle up at an angle, not to strike, but to deflect the incoming blow. The wooden flagpole glanced off the rifle's polished surface with a sharp crack that echoed across the suddenly silent courtyard. Malcolm, thrown off balance by the unexpected deflection, stumbled forward. His momentum carried him directly into Fletcher's carefully positioned stance. The guard's left hand released the rifle, while his right maintained control of the weapon. His free hand caught Malcolm's attacking arm at the precise pressure point that military close combat training had drilled into muscle memory. A swift pivot, a controlled shift of weight, and Fletcher used Malcolm's own aggressive energy against him. The protester's feet left the ground for a suspended moment before he landed on his back with an impact that drove the air from his lungs. The flagpole clattered to the stones beside him. Fletcher's movements, from first response to neutralizing the threat, had taken less than 3 seconds. The guard now stood above the fallen protester, not with anger or triumph, but with the calm efficiency of someone who had simply executed necessary duty. "Stay down, sir," Fletcher spoke for the first time, his voice level and controlled. "Police officers are approaching." The shock of hearing the previously silent guard speak seemed to temporarily paralyze Malcolm as much as the takedown itself. He lay on his back, gasping for breath, staring up with wide, disbelieving eyes. Colonel Harrison had moved with the efficiency of someone whose military instincts remained sharp despite retirement. He retrieved the fallen flagpole, calmly handing it to one of the advancing police officers. "Textbook defensive takedown," the colonel commented quietly to the officer. "Minimum force, maximum control. They still teach it properly, I see." The second police officer helped Malcolm to his feet, while his colleague secured the flagpole as evidence. "Malcolm Reed, I'm arresting you for assault and threatening behaviour with a weapon. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court." Malcolm's face registered a kaleidoscope of emotions: shock, confusion, lingering anger, and finally, the dawning realization of consequences. He attacked me. Did you see that? He threw me to the ground." "After you swung a heavy wooden pole at his head," Colonel Harrison interjected calmly, "I believe at least 30 witnesses and likely several security cameras captured the entire incident." Malcolm's protests diminished as the reality of his situation began to sink in. His eyes found Fletcher, who had already resumed his ceremonial position, stance perfect, eyes forward, as if the interruption had never occurred. "How did you move so fast?" Malcolm asked, genuine bewilderment replacing his earlier aggression. Fletcher maintained his forward gaze, his only acknowledgement of the question a brief, professional response. "Training, sir." As the police led Malcolm away, the protester looked back repeatedly at the guard, who once again stood motionless at his post. The transformation from ceremonial figure to efficient protector and back again seemed to have shaken Malcolm's perceptions more thoroughly than any argument could have. A strange hush fell over the palace grounds in the wake of the confrontation. "Did you see that?" whispered an American tourist to his wife. "I always thought these guys were just for show, but that was something else." Colonel Harrison remained nearby, answering questions from a police sergeant with the precise efficiency of a military man. No, the guard's response was entirely proportional, defensive rather than offensive. He neutralized the threat without causing injury beyond what was absolutely necessary. Tourists gradually began to return to the area, though they maintained a respectful distance from Fletcher's position. Their photo-taking resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. Where before there had been something of a carnival attitude, the guards as colourful attractions, now there was a different quality to their attention, something closer to genuine respect. A palace security official approached Fletcher, speaking quietly near his ear. "Command says well done, handled exactly by protocol. They're reviewing the security footage now." The official paused, then added, "Medical team is standing by if you need it." Fletcher's response was barely perceptible, a slight nod that communicated both acknowledgement and the unnecessary nature of medical attention. 8 years of military service had taught him to distinguish between genuine injury and mere disruption. This incident fell firmly into the latter category. Across the courtyard, a mother knelt beside her young son, speaking in hushed tones. "That's why they stand so still and straight," she explained. "It's not just for tradition. They're real soldiers, always watching, always ready to protect people if needed." The boy nodded solemnly, his earlier excitement at seeing the funny hats replaced by something more substantial, a child's first recognition of duty and sacrifice beneath ceremonial exterior. Back at Fletcher's post, Colonel Harrison approached, stopping at the appropriate distance. He stood at ease, one military man acknowledging another across generations of service. "Lancashire Regiment, 2012 to 2020, Harrison said quietly, identifying Fletcher's service by the insignia barely visible beneath ceremonial attire. "Afghanistan, 2014 and 2016, if I'm not mistaken." Fletcher's eyes remained forward, but the slightest nod confirmed the colonel's assessment. "My son served in Helmand in 2015, Harrison continued. "Said the modern guards receive better close combat training than we ever did." He was right. The colonel straightened, almost unconsciously coming to attention. "Carry on, soldier." Meanwhile, across the courtyard, two police officers were completing their evidence collection, marking the exact positions where Malcolm had stood and fallen. Their methodical work provided a stark counterpoint to the heated emotion that had precipitated the incident. "I always thought they weren't allowed to move," a young father said, his arm around his son's shoulders. "That breaking stance meant some kind of failure." Colonel Harrison shook his head. "Their primary duty is the protection of the sovereign, the palace, and the public, in that order. The ceremonial stance is a tradition that honours that duty, not a restriction that prevents it. They're authorised to respond to genuine threats, and they're exceptionally well trained in determining what constitutes such a threat." At the police vehicle, Malcolm sat with the door open, a paramedic checking his vital signs after the fall. His earlier righteous anger had collapsed into something more complex, a mixture of embarrassment, confusion, and grudging reassessment. "I still believe in the cause," he told the officer supervising him. "The system is broken. People are suffering while wealth concentrates behind those gates." "Your right to that opinion is precisely what these guards have sworn to protect," the officer replied evenly. "But rights come with responsibilities, including the responsibility not to assault people who represent institutions you disagree with." Malcolm looked toward Fletcher, still visible at his post. I thought they were just part of the problem, just mindless enforcers." "Many have seen more of the world's harsh realities than most civilians ever will," the officer said. "They stand guard over principles, not just buildings, including principles that allow for peaceful protest and dissent." 3 days after the incident, Malcolm Reed sat in his solicitor's office, reviewing the options for his upcoming court appearance. The charge of assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard carried potential penalties that had stripped away the last of his bravado. "The palace isn't pressing for maximum charges," his solicitor explained, sliding papers across the desk. "They're satisfied with a suspended sentence and community service, provided you agree to certain conditions." Malcolm stared at the document, the official language blurring slightly as he recalled the moment of impact. Not the pain of hitting the ground, but the precision with which Fletcher had controlled the entire interaction. What conditions? A formal apology to guard Fletcher, and agreement to stay at least 100 metres from all royal residences for 12 months. Malcolm's hand hovered over the pen. The passionate activist in him wanted to reject any compromise, to turn his court appearance into another platform for his grievances. But something had shifted in his understanding since that afternoon. The guard, Fletcher, did he have any say in this? The solicitor looked surprised by the question. As I understand it, he was consulted. His statement indicated that he perceived no lasting threat to the palace or personnel, merely a momentary lapse of judgment exacerbated by legitimate social concerns. Malcolm signed the papers, a wry smile touching his lips. So he actually listened to what I was saying, all while I was screaming in his face. Across London, Guard Fletcher was completing the meticulous preparation of his uniform before reporting for duty. A letter had arrived that morning, a formal notice regarding the resolution of charges against Malcolm Reed. Fletcher had read it once, acknowledged its contents with a nod, and continued his preparation with the same disciplined focus he applied to all aspects of service. His commanding officer had commended his handling of the situation, noting particularly the restraint shown. You could have put him in hospital without breaking regulations, the officer had remarked during review. That you chose minimum necessary force speaks to the highest standards of the Guard. Fletcher had accepted the commendation with the same quiet professionalism with which he accepted all evaluations, positive or negative. In his mind, he had simply performed as trained. No more, no less. The additional attention was unnecessary, even slightly uncomfortable. As he adjusted his bearskin cap to precise regulation position, Fletcher reflected not on the confrontation itself, but on the moments afterward. The shift in how visitors approached the Guard positions, the new quality of respect in their expressions. The parents explaining to children not just what the Guards did, but why it mattered. Those changes, subtle but meaningful, represented something more significant than any official recognition. If this story of duty and restraint made you reflect on the true meaning behind tradition, hit that like button to help others discover it too. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that reveal the depth behind the ceremonial guards, and press that bell icon to never miss our next upload. What would you have done in Guard Fletcher's position? Do you believe there's a clear line between the right to protest and actions that cross into disrespect or danger? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Check out our other Royal Guard stories appearing on your screen right now. The lessons they teach might surprise you.